and welcome to The Swinging Christies, a podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. I'm Dr. Mark Aldridge, I'm an Associate Professor, and I've written a lot about Agatha Christie, including my new book, Agatha Christie's Marple Expert on Wickedness.
And I'm Gray Robert Brown, writer and Christie archaeologist.
Ooh.
Because today, this is a very special bonus episode because...
We are on location. We have escaped. We've missed our connection. We are off to the Christie Archive Trust.
We are. We're thrilled. This is exciting. You've been a few times.
I've been a few
times.
I just was working out the other day. 11 years I've been coming. I know, it's a really long time.
This is where you get all your fascinating tidbits and insights for your book.
Some of it, yeah, absolutely from here. So this is what's sort of informally sometimes called the Christie Family Archive and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically what the Christie family have kept.
So we're going to uncover some fascinating 60s gems.
Yes,
that's the plan.
Yes, absolutely. So I sent the lovely Jo, the archivist, a list of things that we might want to look at, and we're going to browse and see what's there and see what else he might have uncovered for us as well.
Yeah, super exciting.
We really want to have a sense of her process. We haven't really spoken much about her process, but like Agatha Christie as a writer, as a person, how did she actually do that? You know, having a look at things like her notebooks and stuff, and maybe having a look at a few things that are lesser known as well. We'll see how we get on when we get there.
Yeah. And here we are. So we're walking up to the archive as we speak.
Yes. This is the archive that, yes, I know, is it beautiful? Most of it is stuff that was housed at Christie's own house, Greenway, and some other places, which Rosalind, her daughter, then lived in later.
Yeah, so we're talking manuscripts,
we're talking,
letters,
typescripts, letters,
some
notebooks,
recordings,
like
notebooks,
that.
Yeah.
Yes, some of the recordings. So anything that she or Rosalind kept personal possession of. But it also includes things like, or quite often when I'm here, they're getting things out for exhibitions and stuff. So you might see things like her, when she went on the Orient Express, the little leaflets that, you know, it's like a brochure and stuff for it, or her passports and stuff like that. So it's really personal stuff. Let me see if I can open this gate.
So, and this is just one of... You can tell I started in radio drama, kind of. We should say one of many archives the world over that has Christie content.
Yeah, because there's other places. University of Exeter's great because it's got...
Yes, which is my alma mater, which is where that was where I first sort of started my Christie archive journey, I guess, was going to the Bill Douglas. And I remember reading correspondence about the film Agatha from the 70s.
Oh, yes, because that's all there as well.
It is, yeah.
But most of the Agatha Christie stuff is her agent's archive. So Edmund Cork archives, Hughes Massey archive, which is the company. So that's all there, which is absolutely a treasure trove of stuff, but also has gaps, of course. All these archives do. So suddenly you're like, there are no files for that year. And you go, oh.
Yeah, and HarperCollins, the publishers, they have their own archive.
Yes, they do.
There are a few in America, you were saying?
Yes, there are. There are a few there.
So we're looking at, obviously, always looking at 60s goodies. We're specifically going to look for two titles in particular, both of which I think we've already mentioned on the podcast, but they're sort of both 60s almost lost gems, aren't they? Things that didn't quite come to pass.
Yes, for someone who wrote so much, there are always things that Agatha Christie did that didn't quite make it over the final hurdle.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're collaborations. One of these is collaboration, so we're going to be looking at Deathbeat.
Yep.
Which is was planned to be a musical adaptation of Hickory Dickory Dock.
Yep.
And then there's Miss Perry, which is a play that she wrote in the 60s, which didn't get staged, but she worked on for quite a while.
Yeah, and these archives are for, scholarly research, essentially, aren't they? We're incredibly lucky to be able to be granted access. I guess even the fact that we know this will be such a fruitful trip for us flies in the face of that thing that we're always saying, which is that...
Hello.
Hi, this is Gwenny.
Hello, Gwenny.
This is the other archive assistant.
Our main assistant, who will keep our feet warm, I hope.
Hi.
Yes.
Hi. Sorry, Granny, I was just saying, if you'd like to take the mic and explain to the listener...
Yes.
That, yeah, it is... It really does fly in the face of the accusations that Christie was fading, because all the way through the 60s, there's so much correspondence, so many things to look at.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're about to do.
Yes, so exciting. We're here. So we've been looking at Death Beat.
Death Beat is an unproduced jazz musical adaptation of Hickory Dickory Dock from around 1963.
So it's been lovely
Yes.
to come back and revisit it.
And for me, the first time, I've obviously not read it before, so it's very exciting stuff. It's really interesting. There's so much to talk about.
Because it almost sounds a bit like a joke if you say to someone, oh, you know, there was going to be a musical of Hickory Dickory Dock in the 1960s. You're like,
Well,
of course there was, which, you know, if I were to read that in a book maybe a while ago, I'd have thought, yeah, that just means that someone wrote to, you know, Agatha Christie once and said, I'd love to do this. This got a lot further than
Exactly.
that.
I think that's the joke, actually, is that Christie seemed quite positive about it and cooperated with it and engaged with it through its gestation, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the more recent times that I was here and that I spoke to Matthew Pritchard, her grandson, Christie's grandson, he was chatting about that he remembers John Wells, who wrote the book and the lyrics for this, and perhaps Alexis Weissenberg as well, who did the music. But certainly John Wells, and there is a personal connection between John Wells and Matthew Pritchard, because John Wells actually taught Matthew at Eton. So that personal connection will have really helped to sort of bridge the parties, I guess. And he remembers them discussing it. There are letters that are very enthusiastic between Christie and, you know, John Wells in particular, where she's, you know, basically says how excited she is about it. So it's something she really supported.
Yeah. I get the sense that it's not the sort of thing that she would have thought to develop herself necessarily, but as a lifelong music lover, it sort of was interesting and sort of caught her imagination.
Yes, that's true. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of her love of music, but that's absolutely right. But I think she really loved it when someone came up with something original.
Yeah. She's 5 decades into her career at this point, and she's still trying new things, as we've been saying throughout this podcast.
Yeah, and because she's interested in what younger people are doing, and her love of theatre, as we discussed a bit in the Fame episode.
Yeah.
These are all things that come together. So when you think of it like that, it makes more sense.
Yes.
But when you just see it as sort of a bit of trivia on a page somewhere that says, and there was going to be a musical version of Hickory Dickory Dock, that does sound more outlandish than what the reality would be.
Yeah. So we should say, Hickory Dickory Dock is the novel from 1955.
Yeah.
It's a mystery novel. And it's mainly set around a boarding house, a sort of student digs.
Yes, hostel I think it's called.
Hostel.
Yeah.
And involves mysterious items going missing and what ultimately transpires to be a sort of drugs and gem smuggling racket.
Whatever you want to smuggle, you can put them in a in a knapsack in Hickory
And
Dickory
I
Dock.
do.
Yeah.
And I do. Don't believe I don't. So we're looking at, it's called Draft 1, and it's dated to September 1963.
Yes.
But we know that there is correspondence both before and after this point. So we know the idea was sort of being developed even slightly later into the 60s from this.
Yeah, definitely. This is something, as is the case in theatre generally, nobody gets to write a play and then you stage it that year. You're always working with other people to, you know, find the perfect producer, see someone who's interested in it, change it according to what people want.
Yes, I was thinking about this yesterday. This is another thing that's good to myth bust about Christie, is that we're always told, or we're always led to believe, that she could be cantankerous and opinionated, but she loved the theatre, and as you're saying, it's an intensely collaborative medium, and you certainly get the sense through the correspondence and through this project, Deathbeat, that, I mean, it was a collaboration.
It really was, yes.
It also gives us an insight generally into how people were perceiving Christie in the early 60s.
Yes, that's fair.
And how she might have been interpreted for a different medium. What I found particularly interesting looking through this was that there is a great long, I think almost 10 pages of sort of rationale at the start of the document, which you're looking at now.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that, it includes a sort of summary of the concept and the sort of number by number in terms of what the songs are about and how they should be performed and their genre and stuff like that. What I find particularly interesting when it talks about, when it sort of sets out its stall as to what the concept of the musical would be, it's very careful to say, you know, we're not just going to trade on your good name,
Yes.
Agatha. We're not just using you to prop up this project. We actually, and I think it's borne out by the approach. It does seem to take her seriously, to take the content seriously, and it explains in depth actually how using a murder mystery makes a lot of sense for the foundation that would become then an entertaining and popular musical. What it doesn't do, I don't think, is explain why Hickory Dickory Dock as a
Yeah.
foundation. It explains very clearly why a Christie mystery works, and I agree, it works as a foundation for this musical. It doesn't specifically say why Hickory Dickory Dock. And we were talking about this yesterday. I sort of raised this while we were reading it yesterday, and you said maybe the fact that it has such a young, modern, kind of diverse cast might have something to do with it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that speaks to the type of thing that theatre was trying to do in the 1960s,
Yes.
which is to break out of this. And this is one of the explicit things in this introduction, that they talk about it, you know, not being sentimental,
Yeah.
and that it shouldn't be like and it should never feel like a drawing room mystery or anything like
Yes.
that. It's basically saying it's not the mousetrap.
Which
We really
is
don't want you
exactly,
to be the
again, this is
mousetrap.
exactly what we've been saying throughout this project, is that's not just what Christie is. And actually, with if we saw more adaptations that were to extrapolate and put on stage, put on screen the corners of her oeuvre that we're maybe not so readily associating with her, then maybe her popular perception would be different.
Yeah, because there's also this thing, it's very difficult to tell, because obviously it's a script, about things like the dance elements, which seem like they'd be really important, which, because it does say explicitly something like that don't worry, Poirot and Miss Marple aren't going to be doing high kicks through this or anything like that. So it's saying, you know, we're not going to make this seem silly, but it's a modern,
I guarantee that Margaret Rutherford could do a high kick with the best of them. I guarantee.
She's probably high kicking champion of 1942. That's
I could well believe it. Yeah, absolutely. I'm in complete agreement. I was reading it thinking several of these characters fit very neatly into the likes of Bye Bye Birdie, Funny Girl, Hello Dolly, we were talking about yesterday. All, you know, 60s musicals with a similar vibe. It's interesting that you say it's hard to read it and get the full sense of, because obviously by nature of it being not only stage but musical and stage, is that it's hard to get a full sense of the piece just by reading it.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of ink spilt in terms of this character, again, in this rationale section, this character is slow moving, this character is quick moving, this number would be upbeat, this would be a low tempo. You know, clearly a lot of thought has gone into making it a really kinetic piece, explaining how the characters would be kinetic and frenetic, and how they should be represented on stage.
with the songs serving an important purpose. Like, they're not just, oh, people like to go to a musical, so we'll add some songs. They are absolutely, I mean, they're basically mostly monologues of people talking about their lives and their characters and how they're feeling.
Yeah. It's funny, I was reading up a lot about the kind of construction of musicals recently. I've actually got one sort of in development, and all the kind of writing advice does say the best musicals, something will have changed by the end of the song. Yeah. It's not just that a character kind of hold up, stops the action, sings a perfectly nice song, and then the story continues. The story should be communicated through the song, and it's best when kind of a character's coming to a crossroads or a decision-making moment, and by the end of the song they have come to their decision, or they're moving in a different direction. So by that metric, Deathbeat is a successful musical. I guess if we're saying why Hickory Dickory Dock, I guess the other compelling argument for me anyway is, it's fairly recent. If this is something that's been developed in the very early 60s, then it was only published 5 years prior. I guess it's the equivalent of MGM deciding to kick off the Marple series with 450 from Paddington, which similarly had just been released at the tail end of the 50s. But also I noticed, because I was refreshing, I actually took Hickory Dickory Dock to bed with me last night to refresh my memory of it. Because one of the interesting things about adaptations like Deathbeat is seeing the way it diverges, obviously, from the original. I noticed on the front of that copy a Times Literary Supplement, I think a contemporary reviewer had called the book an event, and there was that kind of language about it. And I think there is something about it's not necessarily everyone's favourite novel, Hickory Dickory Dock. It's not necessarily an obvious choice now, and it has some problematic elements as well. But in terms of quite a grabbing concept and like an event concept, it does make sense as a choice for adaptation.
Yeah, I can see that.
Also, I mean, it's certainly not alone in having, we were saying yesterday, it's certainly not alone in having unity of space and time, because so many of, obviously, Christie's mystery novels have that closed circle element. But in terms of staging, I mean, to just put a Diggs on stage, to put Hostel on stage, and the closed circuit of characters that offers you does lend itself quite neatly. So a big difference from Hickory Dickory Dock with Deathbeat is no Poirot, no Miss Lemon, no Georges, and Miss Lemon's sister, who is the lead-in to the mystery in Hickory Dickory Dock, Mrs. Hubbard, has been renamed Mrs. Brackett, and her character's been changed slightly.
So we still have Inspector Sharp from the book, but he's now leading the investigation because Poirot isn't in it. And one of the pieces of trivia that's been recounted about Deathbeat, and there aren't many over the years,
Myth-busting.
we're going to myth-bust, is that Peter Sellers was lined up to play Poirot. The earliest mention of this I can see is in Janet Morgan's biography, which is about 40 years ago, which is brilliant. And I suspect that because at the time she was leaning a lot on stuff that people like Rosalind, so Christie's daughter, could remember. My guess is that there was a bit of a muddle there, and that perhaps Peter Sellers was mentioned as someone who might be in the Alphabet Murders movie, which of course is only a couple of years later and is much more comedic. So you could see that his name might be floating around for that sort of project, and that perhaps they got conflated a little in the retelling. But yes, so even if we thought, well, maybe Peter Sellers is going to play someone else, there is no role here for Peter Sellers, right? He's not going to be interested in playing Sharp, and there's no one else who's a stand-up who would be appropriate for him.
I guess that's a case in point, because this is one of the great kind of lost, unproduced pockets of Christie history. Yeah, it's more likely that myths and rumours sort of pop up around it, and then, like you say, get repeated by various texts.
Because it's all we've got quite often. There are things still in Janet Morgan's book now that we don't quite know where that information came from. There's every chance it's come from somewhere. It's not that, absolutely not that she's made it up or anything, but that wherever that source was, we can't now check against other sources sometimes because we don't know where that was, because it may well have been Rosalind, who hasn't been with us for 20 years.
And isn't that part of the fun of it?
Isn't
that why we keep doing it?
It is.
That's what's so amazing about being here and seeing this, is it's such a...
I remember there is a letter that Janet Morgan quotes that drove me mad for years, because I was desperate to read it and I thought it was really interesting. And it was only about 2 years ago I finally found it in the publisher's archive. So, it had been obviously accessed by other people, including biographers, but just that one, because she doesn't use footnotes or anything. Yeah. And I was like, oh, I'd love to see what that letter actually all reads like. And now I have. And maybe that will turn up in a book one day.
Ooh.
So in terms of our other characters, we've got a sort of selection. You were doing good work in trying to work out how many of these perhaps are reflections or have got parallels in the book. Yeah,
I definitely think, the character list is definitely shorter by nature of practicality, I suppose, in Deathbeat than it is in Hickory Dickory Dock. So we quite possibly have some conflating and also some invention potentially.
Yeah, I noticed when I was going through the list of characters and stuff at the beginning, and that the outline, that there's a character called Leonora who is an art student, I think it says. Yes, South American she is, and apparently very graceful. But it just...
Why did you look at me when you said that?
Well, just naturally. It's your free-flowing locks. When I was sort of just going through the outline, there's just a casual mention about the character. We think Leonora, the man-hating lesbian. This is this already, maybe someone who we might detect as a character type in books and stuff earlier on, but it feels quite a modern thing to be that overt to say. Well, and there's obviously something quite problematic with describing someone in
certainly.
that.
Did you had the quote when she arrives?
Yeah,
right from the first line, from her first appearance, she's characterized as very kind of bullish. And actually, you made the point that Christie depicts a lesbian couple sort of 10 years before this in a really sympathetic and nuanced and positive way in many ways. And maybe that's a reminder that this isn't actually coming from Christie's pen, and maybe that's something that Christie does better than Mr. Wells does.
Yeah, because that's in a Murder is Announced in 1950, and that Hinch and Murgatroyd are very clearly coded as, you know, a lesbian couple. And who, if you read that book and they're not your favourites, I'd be really surprised, because they're so memorable and lovely and very occasional. Like the stage adaptation, not to keep kicking it, removes them. So this also means we're getting a good selection of characters, which, as we were saying, may well be a good reason for why I have this. You don't want to perhaps make it feel like another big family who are getting together. These are very different characters you can put together on stage, and they've got to have a relationship, whether they like it or not, because they're all staying at this one hostel.
Yeah, so I mean, we won't get into it fully, but it's sort of the perennial difficulty with Hickory Dickory Dock and its adaptations, I suppose, which is that Christie, I think, with in many ways the best of intentions, is attempting to create a really, it's a slightly anachronistic way to describe it, but a diverse cast, as in the sense that it's a kind of melting pot and students from all over the world are coming to this house. Unfortunately, several of those depictions are quite uncomfortable to read today, and it's true to say that there are elements of the characterization in Deathbeat which are similarly problematic, but then at least Deathbeat is still attempting that diversity in a way that, for example, the Suchet adaptation of Hickory Dickory Dock does not. It just takes that way to avoid the problem.
Yes, so we have John Field, who's from the West Indies. And one thing I noticed, I don't know if I was thinking about Miss Marple thinking about music and Caribbean mystery as well, but that we learned that he has been recently in a band, which of course ties in with it being a musical, but also that's quite a 60s thing, right? Like people sing the Beatles and other bands who are able to make it through the gigging, you know, in a way that perhaps was not really as available, or there wasn't the scene for even 10 years earlier.
That's true. It wouldn't be an episode of The Swinging Christies if I didn't mention his name, but I'm sure in Sandbrook,
which we don't even have a copy of with us,
and
but you have memorised.
It's always up here. Yeah, exactly. I'm sure he makes reference to the fact that part of that boom in terms of people, like you say, being in bands, learning instruments, is because instruments are becoming more affordable, and like you say, the kind of teen idols are inspiring the growing demographic of teenagers as well. And there are quite a few references like that throughout this that just sort of almost nostalgically put me in mind of all the themes we've covered off in the project so far. You know, obviously there are drugs references in the original novel, but the drugs references in Deathbeat would, if it had been staged, would have felt more significant given the context of it being spoken about more widely in popular culture. As we spoke about in the drugs episode, things like references to the lesbian, things like references to, as you say, the rock and roll landscape.
Yeah. Well, music recurs not just in the songs throughout the play. So it includes, I noted really early on that there's making a real sort of case for saying this is modern, this isn't old-fashioned. Again, going back to what's in the introduction, because we get right near the beginning that David Frost is presenting Housewives.
I noted
Choice
this down
on
as
the
well.
radio.
As you're saying this, I'm like, oh yes, I noticed this as well.
Yeah, but we're told that on this that it's inane.
Yeah, I noticed the same section, but for the reason that it makes specific reference to the song that's being played on the radio having been composed in 1958.
Oh, does
which
it?
basically means that we are in the early 60s.
Yes.
Which again is just staking a claim to this whole drum that we continue to bang, which is Christie was always a contemporary writer. Contemporary adaptations probably knew that better and were more aware of that than maybe we are today.
Yeah.
This is clearly, I think, written to be staged as something that could be set the day that you go and see it.
Yes.
Obviously, it sadly didn't happen. But
I noticed that there was a mention of another pop song on the radio, and it's about snivelling. Like,
yeah,
so it's really sort of like...
It's called I'm Only a Snivelling Baby, which
goodness.
to me is why baby? Why does my baby do this to me when we should be in love?
Yeah,
is that what it's called?
something like that in the And Then There Were None film from 1965.
Which again we talked about in our rock and roll episode. It's what's he called? Johnny Flynn and the something.
Yeah,
Fabian
Johnny
something and the Blackbirds or something. But yeah, it's very much in that same world, that kind of doo-wop pop, isn't it?
Yes. I've got to say that when I wrote about this briefly in the Poirot book, Death Beat, and as I say in a moment, I did get to listen to some of the music, because the music was composed for this, and very kindly, the person who owns that music played me some of the tracks. Unfortunately, I'm not a great music person, so I was like, it's just very free-flowing jazz as far as I'm concerned. Lots of sort of free-flowing on the piano, but I wished afterwards I thought, oh, maybe I should have had someone sat next to me who really understood, so that I could use, well, not so much interpret it, but like to be able to use the correct words to describe it. It felt like a bit Jules Hollandy. I mean, that's I guess the closest that I could say to it. It's very sort of relaxed and open. That's bluesy,
yeah. And I think as well, it's interesting, as I was saying about the diversity, I think it's interesting to extrapolate out this idea that this house is a melting pot of cultures, and then bring it to a musical plane with a genre that's incredibly culturally rich.
And this sort of free form of the music, again, it's just in a script, but it talks about the dancing being very open and free form, and the idea is that it's not going to be structured like everyone's doing, the Macarena or something on set. It's not like...
Mark, take a course in music.
No,
your references.
I know.
You're going to say Eurovision next.
The dance is not like perhaps your traditional West End musical where everyone's dancing in unison, very structured, choreographed to within an inch of its life, and absolutely on the beat. It very much gives a sense that it's much more free-flowing, that it's more like this sort of bluesy jazz.
Yeah, but then also I guess Wells is sort of giving the sort of firing pistol to this interpretation, to these ideas, and then it would be down to the director and the choreographer to bring that. But yeah, there are several musicals in the 60s that are very much looking back, huge hits like The Sound of Music, like Oliver, and it's very much not that. It's very much not that style, as you say.
And Act 2 begins with, there's an aftermath of a murder, and what we get is the reaction of the press outside. It's interesting, if Christie had written this by herself, it had just been her, you'd be thinking, oh, she's talking about the press from her own experiences, obviously.
As quite a private person.
Yes.
And one that was burned by the furore of media attention.
Yes. But actually, it probably isn't. And it's much more, I guess, about John Wells knowing what the press is really like.
I think the word scrum is used, or if not, then it very much feels it. It is really, it's clever theatrically in terms of starting the act with lots of energy and lots of vibrancy on stage. But also, it definitely has negative connotations. And this goes into the lyrics of their song. They have a song.
They have a song which lists all of the things that the press love to report on, so everything from political scandals to prank phone calls to vicars, through to things like juicy murders are referred to, and lots of things, and then basically saying we'll pay 50 quid for a really juicy story,
and showing it as modern as well. That is specifically, it talks about television cameras and lights and
stuff about cabinet scandals and stuff is very early 1960s, the sort of thing that they might well be reporting on.
Again, we're taking a trip down memory lane and remembering previous episodes, because that's something that we touched on in Armageddon, and again, it's the sort of reference that a contemporary audience would be picking up on.
Apparently there was tittle-tattle about royalty in the newspapers. Imagine a time when occasionally there might be tittle-tattle about royalty in the newspapers.
Similarly, these sort of outbreaks of dynamism on stage, you can tell that the script is very much written with those things in mind. And there's a section which please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it's in Hickory Dickory Dock, which is when there's a tussle with a blade between John and Colin, sort of middle of Act 2. And it does feel like we're gearing up towards the finale at this point. And it ties in with the fact that one of the crimes that's been committed, or one of the strange goings on, is that people are finding their bags and their coats slashed with a knife. So it's supposed to cast suspicion on John. But again, with the early 60s context of, and it's the sort of thing that Christie has mentioned, we've talked about it several times, gangs with flick knives and those sorts of things that she highlights as modern. As you were reading those press lyrics, I couldn't help but think of the list that Christie provides us in books like By the Pricking of My Thumbs in terms of the things that she's reading in the newspapers.
Yes.
It's not a million miles away. And you observed, and I agree, it does come to quite a fairly quick end.
Yeah, not quite an Agatha Christie end. You know, if you read the book,
I wonder if part of that is a side effect of not having Poirot and Miss Lemon.
Maybe.
Because when I was rereading the start of Hickory Dickory Dock last night, it struck me how there's so many layers bringing us into the mystery, and then similarly, I guess you get that kind of Coda epilogue bringing you out of it, where what have we learned today, kids, almost, which you don't get. But interestingly, it is the same killer as in the book. That's become over the years, especially nowadays, one of the hot questions that we ask around new adaptations is it has the identity of the killer changed, but the mechanics of the plot, as far as I can tell, and the culprit are the same as Hickory Dickory Dock.
Yeah, and I think the fact that it is such a relatively abrupt ending, it's only a couple of pages really from the reveal to the final curtain, is due to the fact that actually it's not as important in this, as they say in their outline, that it's a way to discuss the impact that these events have on these groups of people. And so, of course, you want to know who's behind it, but that's perhaps not the driving force of the story in a way that an Agatha Christie novel might be. The driving force is how this affects characters, what this says, and that might well be an indication for why that big press moment is so important, because we see, you know, characters being distressed, they're having to, you know, get through the press whilst they're holding up their cameras at the front door and stuff. So it makes sense that actually you might want to balance the story in a slightly different way.
Yeah, amazing. What a find. And in this folder, very excitingly, oh my God, so this is Miss Perry.
Yes.
Miss Perry is an unproduced play, a farce with hints of fantasy, completed in the mid-1960s.
Several copies of it, in fact.
This was the other main thing we really want to see today, because it's another big unrealised project of the 1960s that's sort of slightly shrouded in mystery, although...
And like Deathbeat, very much atypical of what we might think of as classic Christie.
Yes, which is another example of her using, I guess, the height of her fame to say, well, yes, I'll continue to do those mysteries, but I'm going to try stuff that I'm excited about too.
But I'm also going to do my passion project. Yeah. So basically, the story is that of a mysterious, who we're told is a fairy, landing in the middle of an English festival pageant in the build-up to it, and then the aftermath of her appearance. And it came out of conversation with Margaret Lockwood.
With Margaret Lockwood, who had worked with Christie when Lockwood starred in Spider's Web. Good partnership.
Of course, filmed
and yes,
for 1960, which we've talked about earlier in the series.
We have, yes. With Glynis Johns in the role in the films. I was a bit struck when I read this, because I've heard that story. I hadn't read Miss Perry before, unlike Deathbeat. So it's the first time I've read it properly, rather than sort of skimming it. And I was quite struck by the question of who Margaret Lockwood might play in it, because I think she could play Miss Perry, but Miss Perry is explicitly described as being young, and there's a whole thing about her potential relationships with younger male characters in it. And hey, I'm in my 40s. I would really love to think of myself as being young, but I think I would be surprised if Margaret Lockwood was seen as a natural fit for this role, as somebody who'd been the wicked lady on screen, had very much a sort of history of being someone who's very sexual on screen for quite a long time. Sexual on screen for quite a long time, or having that sort of edge to her, feeling very adult as a character, you know, in the types of characters she was playing. They were grown-up, strong women. To suddenly be this slightly mysterious, almost ethereal, younger female character in the 60s. So we know that this was instigated by Conversation in 1962.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we were talking extensively yesterday about when we might date this to. It's unambiguously the 1960s. Our friend Jamie Bernthal, he says, estimates range in terms of dating it from 62 to as far as the 70s. But he dates it at 64. It's very interesting because obviously we know that Christie continues to tinker for years sometimes, especially as this wasn't produced. So then it would be farmed around to various producers and then it would be tweaked each time.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a misnomer to say that we could ever sort of definitively date it. But a reference that really stood out to me as significant is that we're specifically told that the Queen Elizabeth, and Prince Philip visited India and Pakistan the year before within the narrative. And we know through contextual research that in January to March 1961, not only was there a hugely publicised trip that the Queen and Philip did to India and Pakistan, but it was actually her first to India.
Right.
So it would have been very much all over the TV reports. And in fact, later, another character does make reference to seeing images on TV of the Queen on this trip. And that's interesting as well, given that we've just recorded the Fame episode and we were talking about Christie's slight distaste for television. But if there's anything that Christie is going to sneak downstairs and watch on her cook's TV screen, it would be, I imagine, images of Queen Elizabeth.
Yes, you're right.
On a special news report. What's interesting, what complicates this further, strap in everyone, is that we're then told that there were Africa trips next. Now, the Queen did visit Ghana, Sierra Leone and the Gambia in subsequent months of 1961. What we think makes a compelling argument for 1964 as a main date of composition and as a setting is that there is reference to the 23rd of June, which is when the action starts, being a Tuesday, which it was in 64, as you pointed out. But then, very kindly, Archivist Joe brought out the earliest draft of Miss Perry that we have, and interestingly, that line had been altered by Christie's own fair hand.
Yes. Because originally, well, there are two changes, aren't there? Because she's added the 23rd as a date, and originally it said Thursday, and that's crossed out and it's changed to Tuesday.
Yes.
But we don't know, obviously, what order that was, or whether there's any significance to that whatsoever.
No, well, it looks to me like Thursday was crossed out on the typewriter and then changed to Tuesday as in situ, whereas the 23rd was added by pen later.
Yes.
But I think you could make a case too. It had been first drafted in 1962, and then by 1964, in order to bring it into line with that year, she dates it to an authentic Tuesday.
Oh, maybe.
However, you also made the point that writers get days and dates wrong all the time.
Yes.
And, you know, it's the equivalent of me writing something set this January and saying Tuesday the 8th. And like, I don't know, was the 8th of Tuesday? I couldn't tell you, but I probably wouldn't check it.
Yeah. For me, it's no different to saying, oh, it was a lovely, March day. And you go back and go, oh, actually, the weather in March was awful. And there's a, it's like you don't think that through particularly, I think it's right. And there are so many times that I've seen this thrown up as there's an error in this book or this TV or on this film because it wasn't Tuesday on the 8th or whatever.
We did say, if you're going to say that, you may as well say, did a fairy arrive on that day? Because I'm fairly sure there are other elements to the story that are made up. Also, you mentioned yesterday that we know that Christie herself visited India in 1960.
Yes.
And not only is Indian culture quite significant to much of Miss Perry, and in particular the key symbol of the elephant, and even I know that the tortoise in some Indian cultures is linked to Vishnu, for example. So there is very much this spine to this play.
Yeah, because these are some of the perhaps illusions, perhaps, what do you call them, spells or whatever that Miss Perry may do. So at some point she may produce an elephant and someone maybe turns into a tortoise. A lot of questioning about whether that is, a genuine fairy casting a spell or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
So it would make sense that the composition would date from when Christie's India trip is fresher in her mind, perhaps, which again pushes us more towards 62 than 64. It's only the difference of 2 years. But the other reason why I think it's unlikely to be any later into the 60s is that by 1965, sadly, the Indo-Pakistan War had broken out. So it's no royal visits were on the cards for a stretch after that, for obvious reasons. And I think you would then be unlikely to make reference in a ostensibly contemporary play to a royal visit without also mentioning what was going on or saying that the visit had been a few years ago or something like that. So it's the joy of these things that we can never really be sure. But I would put my money on, obviously 62 as the instigator and the main drafting, and then sort of tinkered with through 63 and 64, and then broadly left alone after that.
Yeah.
And one of the first things you said, so I sat with Deathbeat, you sat with Miss Perry initially,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the first things you said was, "We've got a long-haired young man."
We've got a long-haired young man on the edge of a nervous breakdown.
We have a long-haired young man
who's
everybody.
also of the sort of arty disposition, so
Left-leaning, we're specifically told.
Yes, so more as a writer than as an artist, but nevertheless little hints of the type of person we might see in, say, Third Girl.
Exactly, exactly the sort of figures that we saw in The Pale Horse and The Third Girl.
Yes, so that's immediately setting out its stall, because we weren't sure, because I said only ever flipped through this briefly before, I think, and I did wonder, we've come all this way, and are we going to be like, there's nothing really 60s here, and you can have written this any time?
Find something.
But
this
we
is the
found
joy
it
of this project. This is the magic of this
immediately.
project. Do you know what's funny is, just as an aside, that gag where someone says about him being left wing, and then someone else says, "Oh, I thought that was what you said about a country house."
yes. Which is also a joke about the character. It's not like
It's
But there's lots in here about what we might consider left-wing people to be, isn't there? There's descriptions and
well, so then after that, when it's debunked by saying that Miss Perry can't also be left wing because she's not sort of grubby and like sort of
with
not,
dirty hair and
with
stuff
dirty
like
hair
that.
and things like that. So it's very much Little England on stage, which makes sense for the play. And we're explicitly told that he's part of a Chelsea set.
Yes.
Again, Third Girl.
Yes.
That's not just us reading this into it, but with our bias of having done however many episodes of this project. It's there on the page in blue and white.
On page one.
On page
Not even
one.
like at the first half of page one.
Yeah.
We've already got our swinging Christies content. Thank you very much.
Right,
Dame
that's it. We can
Agatha.
go home now.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, Councillor Waldron, very early on again, says specifically to sort of mind the younger generation who want all this kind of sex and obscenities in their plays, which very much has a wink and a nudge to the audience. It's very much classic Christie kind of metatextual, that stuff that she loves playing with. We spoke about in the Fame episode the fact that theatre was still censored until the end of the decade, and that was still very much a contended issue in popular culture. And the joke being, and we're encouraged to take this with a pinch of salt, because the joke is that maybe they should focus on the sort of reliable old classics like "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," to which obviously it's pointed out that there's an obscenity in that title, and it carries through the play.
Yeah, well, Martin is as this left-leaning writer. Later on, he's talking.
Disgusting. Can you imagine such a thing?
I can't. Who would even sit on the sofa next to such a character? But there is a little discussion with another character, Mr. Wiley, later on about money, and Mr. Wiley says to him, and Julius Green happened to pick this out. It's funny that I noticed that he said this as well, and I noticed as well, because he picked out in his great book about Agatha Christie's stage work that Mr. Wiley says you can put on one of those newfangled plays about a tramp and a drunk and a tarts all meeting in a public lavatory, because that's the sort of thing that apparently a left-leaning writer would really want to do. And do you know what? I'm not sure he's completely wrong. That in the 1960s.
You said yesterday it doesn't sound a million miles away from a Joe Orton.
Joe Orton play, yeah, I could absolutely see that.
But also, I love the composition of that. Christie is, we've said it many times, a comic writer. That has the drunk and a tart, and it has that rhythm of it's like one of those jokes, like an Englishman, a Welshman, and a Scotsman going to a bar. She's clearly lampooning here.
Yes.
And this joke / theme is kind of threaded throughout and then paid off right at the end, which is that Miss Perry sort of runs off and gets her happy ending, and her is off to get married actually. But another thing they're doing besides getting married is they're off to see a play, and we're specifically told that the sort of urbane play that they're seeing will be featuring, sex workers and remand homes and things like that.
Yes.
But there's a irony from Christie in presenting a play which is seemingly quote unquote well made, quite trad, and having this spine of kind of taking pot shots at maybe some of the theatre that's fashionable at the time, but also in some ways this play is also quietly subversive, like a lot of her 60s works.
Well, there's this whole thing about early on that we're told about the council having an obsession with cleanness and decency and things like anti-Americanisms, and a little bit like some other texts from the 1960s, the people who are superficially most important part of society and most respected are not necessarily those that you can trust and might well end up being rather villainous in some ways. Actually.
Exactly, yeah, you've always got to look at not just what Christie is putting into the mouths of her characters, but also what we're left with as an impression of said character by the end of the text, because it may well be that they were a murderer. Should we talk about Miss Perry generally, given that it's named after her and she is the centre of the play? It's significant, I think, that she is kept off stage for quite large chunks of this, and particularly before her first entrance, she's very much built up to, isn't she, and anticipated, and you do get this sense that her arrival in this, as you say, small, quite staid community sends ripples.
Yes.
She's also fairly absent in Act 2 as well. It's a 2-act play, and then when she reappears, you noticed.
In the typescript, she's always referred to as Miss Perry for her dialogue in Act 1. But when she reappears in Act 2, she's suddenly called Tanya, which is her first name. Titania, indeed. Which is, of course, from A Midsummer Night's Dream, the name of one of the fairies.
Yeah.
And some people wonder if that's actually a sign of her being Russian, because Tanya might be a Russian name.
Oh, yes.
Russian communist.
And of course, we're, as we said in our Armageddon episode, we're well aware at this point that audiences may well be sitting up and listening and thinking, and the images in their heads are slightly different going into the 60s when we hear words like Russian and communist.
Yes, absolutely.
The Titania reference being interesting as well, because it's something Christie's done throughout her career, isn't it? She's such a lover of Shakespeare, and as recently to this as The Pale Horse, being inspired by Macbeth in some ways.
But I think that's quite interesting because the audience isn't going to know that that's changed in the script, but it perhaps says a little bit about the way that Christie perceived it is almost a different character when she comes back. She's really such a mystery in the first act.
Yes.
Is she actually able to perform these sort of spells or whatever? And then there's a whole bit at the beginning of the second act where, as you say, she's off stage for ages and everyone's wondered what's gone on and what the truth is about her. And when she comes back, she does start to become a bit more human.
Well, sorry.
Got so excited.
I did.
Humans!
I'm excited about fairies. Exactly. It's significant. I think that's exactly what she's saying, which is that when she comes back, she is more personal. We know her more intimately. We understand her a bit better now. And she does become a real character with a real ending. And also, it transpires, of course, that she isn't really a fairy. It's a revenge plot, I suppose.
It is, yes, it is.
Which means that we can take her down from the pedestal. The scales are going to fall from our eyes. We are going to understand her better in Act 2. So it makes sense that the script would flag that up to someone reading it.
That's true. And it's a little bit pale horsey in that thing of going, is she actually going supernatural here? Because
does she exist? Is she real?
Yes.
Exactly. That's the tension, particularly about. Well, for most of the play, that is the tension, isn't it? And we have things like Martin, wondering if he's hallucinating, if he's mad, if he's raving mad. Words like mad and psycho are thrown around a lot, which again, as we talked about in our horror episode, those things are meaning potentially something, or would have meant if this had been staged, something different to a mid-60s audience. He even specifically asked to know the science behind her appearance. And the kind of tricks, as you say, conjuring elephants and tortoises and all the rest of it, that she appears to be performing. And I noticed at one point Poppy says, words to the effect of, if Tanya is mad, then so am I. And of course, they are in cahoots, it turns out.
Yes. But in terms of the science behind it, well, she's got an A-level in being a fairy, we're
She
told.
does.
But she didn't finish her postgraduate degree, which indicates that she must have done an undergraduate degree.
Interesting. She is in wish fulfillment, I believe, her A-level.
Oh, is that what it was?
It's in wish fulfillment.
Oh, I see. And that made me look up A-levels, actually, because I thought, I don't know how long A-levels have been going for. 1951, apparently.
Oh, so still fairly recent.
Relatively new.
Yeah. And there's like, she says she's from a family of fairies.
Yes.
I thought that was interesting. There's that bit where she sort of, her suitcase is suspiciously light, which puts us on notice. As you say, like with the pale horse, the whole way through, you're questioning what she is, what her story is, how much exactly we should be reading into aspects of her character. But then she says, "Oh, I've got everything I need in here." And I love that section as well, where she's sort of revealing things from the suitcase, and it's like abracadabra. And at one point, she pulls out a brassiere, which is very Afternoon at the Seaside.
Yes.
I kept saying as we were reading, didn't I, that it kept putting me in mind of Afternoon at the Seaside, which is arguably something else that dates it to earlier in the 60s, is that it does feel stylistically and tonally very similar to that play, down to the fact that there's the sort of end of the pier, almost musical-y type tone, but then with a undercurrent of jewel heist, essentially.
Yeah, because reading it, I for some reason I wasn't thinking of that. I thought of the later play from the early 70s of Fiddler's 3 or Fiddler's 5, depending on which version, how much had been cut by the time you saw it.
Depending on your predilection.
Depending on, where you got to see it. But that is much more farcical than this, actually. But this feels like a journey towards that. Like it's starting to be, because it's more of a farce, I would say, than say Spider's Web. But Spider's Web has got real farcical elements, because hiding a dead body and all this sort of stuff. This feels more of that. And then Fiddler's 3, Fiddler's 5, which is also sort of about hiding a dead body in a slightly different way and farcical ways they get around this and all sorts of things. That is really pushing it even further.
Interesting, yeah.
So this is a like midpoint of that journey, perhaps.
Yeah, the only way in which it deviates massively from Afternoon at the Seaside in my head is the fact that you don't then have almost the sort of palette cleanser or the tonal evener of the other two plays in the Rule of Three.
That's true.
And that's funny, isn't it? Because there is something, I think you embrace some of the camper elements of Afternoon at the Seaside very positively, because it was designed to be offset by the comparative darkness of the rats and the patient. But obviously Miss Perry is standalone. It doesn't have that dark companion. Did you notice at one point Mr. Wiley, so that's Martin's dad, the left-leaning playwright's dad, calls her Miss Perishing Perry. And I was like, because perishing to me is like cold.
Yeah.
But she's not cold, is she? Or is it? Does he mean it in a sort of like she's annoying?
Oh,
like
maybe, or perishing, as in when something sort of dissolves, or you get perished fruit and stuff.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's just a brilliant image. It's really. I sort of sat and pondered it for a while, which I mean, arguably is a sign of great dialogue.
But again, it's there's so much of these little things in Agatha Christie, but the people will often write to me and say, I've seen this little reference in a book. Well, do you know what it means? And I'll be like, I don't even remember that reference. And I've read that book maybe a dozen times, because sometimes you don't quite notice those little moments,
of course,
where she's referring to a turn of phrase or something, and your brain just fills in the blanks because you know what the characters are like, and so
you're just reading it in their tone. You're caught up in the story. Yeah. Well, I mean, and in a way, that's kind of that's been one of the big joys of this project, is that we've been able to look at the 60s works with that particular lens of let's pick up those references, let's pick up those turns of phrase that might be specifically relevant or uniquely contemporary. So we're sort of directly looking for it. And then, there have been tons of people that have reached out to us and gone, I never spotted that Cuba is mentioned in Caribbean Mystery, or whatever it may be.
Yes.
Speaking of, dare I say, iconic contemporary references, Miss Perry reappears, costume change, and she's wearing a Nina Ricci dress.
Yes, which which is perhaps another indication as to the truth of her character, as she starts to become a little bit less fantastical, perhaps, as things move
Yes,
on.
well, also, it's a clue that she has money.
Money, yes, because I'm so fashion conscious. I'm so into my fashion that when I read Nina Ricci dress, I thought, I think that might be a real designer, so I'll Google it because that's how well I know my fashion.
Yeah, well, I also Googled it. And what's interesting is I also searched when you mentioned that, because we're explicitly told that the play is set in June. And I found this beautiful. I mean, we can't know that this is what Christie intended, but this is a 1960 summer dress. But yeah, it's it's quite floaty, sort of almost chiffon. Is it chiffon material?
Is it a bit fairy-like?
It is quite fairy-like, yeah. And this one in particular is sort of pink, orange, splashes of yellow in stripes, and a kind of halter neck, and brought in just under the bust, and paired with some lovely red stiletto heels. But yeah, you can see, I mean, this is exactly the sort of fashion that people don't think about when they think about Christie's writing, because they think about fishes and what is it the Marple wears in the 20s, like a lace cap or something. That's what people think of, or tweed or something. But yeah, devastatingly cool, very much reds and pinks, and it's interesting. So Miss Perry says that her original fairy costume, she almost brushes it aside, the costume she's wearing before, and she says, "Oh, that was just what I travel in." Essentially, she's raising the game now as we get towards the climax of the play. I wonder if, and I'm being quite serious here, I wonder if there is a legitimate reading. We know that fairy was common slang at the time for queer, for gay, and I wonder if there is a reading there, because there are quite a few, certainly in terms of the reaction that Christie's looking to inspire from her audience. There are several lines, things like, oh, you know, fairies don't do things like that, or like, I'm from a family of fairies, or me and my fairies, and things like that I couldn't help but wonder if we're supposed to be titillated by some of those. And good nature, we say as queer men, like good natured sort of jibes, I wonder.
That's funny. I hadn't thought of it like that, but there's that whole thing about the person who Tanya is dating. His parents don't want him to
run off with a fairy. With a fairy. Yeah. He is already, you know, tight trouser wearing and long hair. So dare I say there were questions already being asked about Martin long before the fairies came and took him away.
That's a really good point. I really like that. I think that there is definitely perhaps a bit of wordplay there. We can say.
Yes, absolutely.
Whether it's all meant to be a metaphor might be stretching it a little bit, but it's.
And it adds to the humour of it.
Yeah, it does. And I was chuckling all the way through reading this. I won't say that it's charming. It's, you know, it's not always the most sophisticated humour sometimes, but sometimes the way that characters talk to each other, the dialogue's really strong in this.
And one final point really is just that it's, you know, we had such a lovely day just kind of reveling in these two brilliant Christie gems that so few people have had the joy to see, but obviously in reading them side by side, you inevitably your brain starts to go there. And I found it fascinating that we do get mention in Miss Perry of a coat that's been hacked to pieces, and which is literally what happens in Hickory Dickory Dock / Deathby.
And as you were looking at, I was reading one and you were reading the other. Exactly. We both reached the point at the same time.
Yeah. And not to mention the backdrop of dual hijinks, which obviously is not exclusive to these two texts, but it is prevalent in both. And arguably, they're from a very similar time. You know, is there an argument to say, if we certainly date the beginning of the composition of Miss Perry to 62, at that point Christie is starting to have these conversations with Wells about Deathby, and is that bringing her back in mind of that book that she wrote at that point 7 years ago, Hickory Dickory Dock.
So as well as Miss Perry and Deathbeat, while we're here, we've taken the opportunity to have a look at some of the other material used by Agatha Christie in her writing process, because this is one of the things that I think is really difficult. I'd say this to you, dear listener, but very difficult to explain unless you see it, when you actually can get a sense of how the documents all work together, because her process was not just, I'll sit down and I'll type out a story and I'll send it off. She would, as many people I'm sure know, work from her notebooks initially. So she's got dozens of these notebooks, which aren't in any particular order. So she might pick up a notebook 10 years later and write a new story in it because, you know, she'd found it at the bottom of a bag or something. And that's where she would plan out lots of stories. We were just looking fairly randomly at some stories, the ones that I'd happened to pick out while we were here. And I was reading out to you some of the stuff and saying, she was thinking about this for this story, and this has got no resemblance to it. And some of the stuff is you can see that she's starting to work out there's one key idea.
Yeah. It's a real testament to her fertile imagination that almost every story and so many that didn't even make the cut, that didn't even come to fruition, it seems like they could go in a million different directions.
That's exactly it. Yeah. And you can see that she's thinking about not always the mystery first either, but it might be a character, it might be a particular setting. So that's a really intriguing way, because when she says in interviews, I really haven't any method. I mean, I don't agree with her, but I can understand that from her perspective, she can't see the method because she was so driven by instinct.
Or yes, exactly. And also, is it, again, a bit of self-deprecation and a bit of, you know, it's not maybe as organised a method as maybe she thinks that a journalist or whoever is looking for in that moment. But actually, there is a beautiful organisation to it. It's just all in her head, you know. It's just very idiosyncratic and unique to her, which is one of the reasons why her writing is such alchemy, why it ends up so charming, because it's also uniquely her. Yes.
And the range of stuff that she's considering in one notebook can often be like such an indication of so many things going through her brain that we always hear things like, when people discuss the notebook, saying, and you might find a shopping list, or I was just saying she was working out her checkbook, I think, in one of them. But that will be alongside her maybe thinking about the patient I was just reading about, you know, for example. Oh my goodness, our assistant is desperate to help us.
The archive assistant.
Gwenny, is desperate to come in and be
She's not started barking yet, but if I don't let her in shortly, she will. So let me just one sec. Come on then.
Well, here she is. Oh, I know.
Are you going to help us record?
Will you help us, please?
Are you going to help us record, Gwenny?
Oh, shall we give you some attention?
Chaos.
Oh, don't eat the cable.
Yeah, don't eat the mic. That's sort of crucial.
That's the only thing we really need. She's bored of us already now. Oh, she's playing hardball with Greg. Okay.
Oh, baby. Mwah.
There is a wonderful picture of Gray cuddling Gwenny, which we may put online. Oh, that's a very happy trot off. She's had her rubs and she's gone. Yeah, but I mean, that is Agatha Christie, and especially Agatha Christie in the 60s.
Also, how Agatha Christie that we would be distracted by an adorable dog. I mean, that's classic Agatha. Yeah, and also the adjacencies in the notebooks are sometimes might appear to the untrained eye as more baffling than they actually are, because she's just kind of picking, as you say, picking them up years later and adding and filling in gaps and filling in pages. There's not a real order to them, which again is part of the charm. So she's got these extensive notes, and often, and John Curran talks about this in his Secret Notebooks volumes a lot. Often there'll be repetition. There'll be she'll sort of work up an idea, work around it, move it in different directions, all the rest of it through successive note sessions, I guess. When it comes to write it, then often by the period we're looking at in the 1960s, she's dictating it into her trusty dictaphone.
Yes.
And we actually just saw the dictaphone,
Yes.
which is usually here.
Well, there is a second one here as well.
Oh, is it?
There's one up in the
We were
archive, yeah.
chasing Agatha's dictaphone across country because basically, so if you're not an avid follower of our social media, you might not know this, but we had a day out in Cambridge a couple of days ago, partly to see the exhibition Murder by the Book, and there on loan from the Christie Archive Trust is one of her dictaphones, used throughout the 60s, purchased in 1959, so perfect for us. And an additional treat is we put on, would you like to tell them what we put on?
Well, one of the things that I'd asked Joe before we came here was that we would really like to actually listen to some of Agatha Christie reading. So basically, she would dictate the whole of her novels, which would then be sent off to a typist. So it's her speaking the whole novel. And I'd said that in particular, I knew that the Endless Night tapes existed, because they don't all exist because they were all reused often.
Sure.
So
as in taped over.
Yes, as in taped over. Yes. So, but I knew Endless Night had survived because I'd heard a little bit of it a while ago, and so I asked Joe if we could listen to some, which was amazing. So we decided that we couldn't listen to all of it because it's
11 CDs long.
Yes.
I genuinely got chills, and I'm not just saying that. In particular, we were listening to the climax of that book, which is incredibly intense and visceral. Listeners may remember the exact passage that we just listened to. We quoted from extensively at the end of our sex episode, where we were talking about when Michael really loses it and his descent into this kind of violent, misogynistic language, and hearing 70-something Agatha Christie dictating that and conjuring it as well. You know, the word trance was bandied about. It did feel like she was, again, such a fertile mind, just sort of bringing this story to fruition. And really, although, you know, her age, her gender, her voice is so far removed from Mike's, the way she evoked his character in the way that she was speaking his words was really quite incredible.
It was, because it opened with her reading the Endless Night sort of poem at the beginning, and to have that be the first thing we heard as we pressed play,
hearing her say the words Endless
it,
Night.
yes, with these sort of big speakers next to us, we were quite enveloped by the sound. That was quite something.
And throughout she pronounces Greta.
Yes.
So we've discovered that everyone's been saying Greta wrong for
that's our contribution to knowledge.
More than 50 years.
If we've done nothing else for the world of Agatha Christie scholarship.
Yeah, you heard it here first, everybody.
First.
No, I did a bit of digging afterwards, and I think it's a legitimate pronunciation in Germany, in German-speaking places.
So that's just one of the many ones, but it's just one that we happen to pick today.
Yeah. Because it's so great. And it's Matthew Pritchard's favourite Agatha Christie.
It is, yes.
Endless Night.
Yeah.
So she's dictated the novel.
Yes.
It goes off to the typist.
Goes off to a specialist typist. So I think it changed a little in the 60s, but it used to be like not on normal tapes. It was on these sort of band things.
One of the things
ribbons.
Right. One of the things I
yeah.
found quite interesting was I half expected her to say, you know, comma and speech marks and things like that, and she doesn't.
No.
But we do know, but I think it's a testament actually to her delivery, and we talk about Christie in the theatre, and maybe Christie's got more theatrical chops than we've given her credit for in the past, but it says something about her delivery that I think it is often clear. The intonation, it's clear what punctuation she's implying, where the speech is supposed to start and stop. And I say this as an audiobook maker, it's, you know, you can tell these things. But then, of course, she gets the typescript back from the typist, and she even, through the 60s, late in her life, in the 70s as well, is correcting and annotating actively.
Yes, so you can basically pick up any of the ones. So often there are multiple typescripts here. Sometimes there's
We've
only
seen
one.
Several.
Yeah, because the 60s and 70s are the best represented for,
Sure.
I guess, obvious reasons. There aren't so many earlier ones. But there are some for which there are multiple typescripts
Yeah.
because there are different versions.
Yeah.
So that's not her doing a full rewrite, but her
No.
doing corrections and then it coming back
Yeah.
and her doing extra things. So you can look at some like A Caribbean Mystery, which I looked at not that long ago, and that's got some really nice little annotations, changes, but lots of it is just editing out of sections which I speak about in the Marple book. So some of them are in there, and just
Order now.
yes, and just tidying things up. So, for example, Endless Night, there are 3 of them. There are 3 different typescripts.
And amazing to hear it, and then to be able to turn around and sort of thumb through these 3 folders.
Yes.
And find the 3 different
Yes.
versions.
Sometimes there's very minor differences. Sometimes she's added. I was talking to someone else who's here yesterday about Elephants Can Remember, and she said that comes up a lot in Elephants Can Remember.
Oh,
I
yes,
said,
yeah.
yes, well, you should read the typescript because she cut out quite a lot of those in the typescript stage.
And I said, what did I say? Well, do you say that When Dawn Appeared Fresh and Rosy Fingered comes up too often in the Odyssey? No, you don't, because it's poetry and it's meant to be remembered and it's lyrical and it's a classic and it's beautiful, and so is Elephants Can Remember, and that is the hill that I will die on. It's good. It is good.
It's good.
Sort of tucked away in these little folders that we were sort of rummaging through of annotated typescripts for titles like Endless Night. I was quite amazed to find things like really detailed character lists,
Yes,
locations.
yes.
In some cases, specifically about standardizing the spelling. I wonder if, the Christie that was burned all those years ago by Coco is still, she's still got that in the back of her mind.
Or a murder is announced with problems with the spelling of a word is a clue.
Oh, of course,
and
yeah.
she has to keep saying,
Please don't correct
yes,
this is
please don't correct
deliberate.
this.
Yeah.
But people did keep correcting it.
Yeah. The fact that even at that stage of composition, she's still sort of getting, and chapter lists as well, she's still getting it very straight in her head where everything is, what everything is. And I guess I'm going to use the words late style again, but just another reminder that this kind of myth that we've been fed of Christie being a bit kind of woolly in this decade and later, look at those detailed lists. Like she's got a much tighter grip on the composition of these titles than some fans give her credit for, I think.
And she isn't giving herself an easy ride, is she?
No.
Because various of the typescripts we've looked at from around this period have got really quite detailed annotations and changes, like handwritten extra pages that she's dropping in, crossing out whole sections. There are a couple where you can see studying the page numbers is a whole academic study in itself, because she crosses them out and things get rearranged and moved around. So she's really working to make it as strong as she can make it. It's not like she's thinking, I'll spend 6 weeks dictating a story and I'll never see it again, and that'll be good enough.
Yeah, it's not just a sausage factory, which is famously her own modest description of her work. Yeah, what an amazing the insight that we can have into her process in places like this is. It's so rich.
Yeah, it's a real privilege for the archive to have allowed us to come and look at it. So, so many thanks to the archive and Joe and everybody.
And we're back.
We're back.
What a lovely trip. We're just stepping off not the 450 from Paddington, but
the 507 to Paddington.
It's close enough, isn't it? It's close enough. Thank you for joining us on this trip to the archive, dear listener. We will be back. Please stay subscribed to our feed. There are plenty more bonus episodes coming up, aren't there?
Yes.
We've got so many plans on the horizon. I almost just careered into that cleaning cart then. We're actually walking down, well, not quite, but almost where Margaret Rutherford would have walked. So
her ghost was saying, stop dissing the movie. But we don't. We love her.
We love her. We love her.
In its own way. So you can, of course, get in touch with us at Christie_time. That's on X and Instagram. You can get hold of us individually on X. I'm at Dr. Mark Aldridge. Gray is at classic_Graham. And
We also just got run over by a luggage cart.
And yes, please email us if you've got anything that you want us to know about. So theswingingchristies@gmail.com. And of course, you can find links to my books and events or whatever we're getting up to in the bio.
Yes, yeah, including Mark's new book, Agatha Christie's Marple Expert on Wickedness, which has loads of excellent Margaret Rutherford content.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. The Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 25th of April 2024. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio and our music is by Dar Golan. Now let's get through the ticket barrier. Ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba.
Very good.
Guess the tune.
Guess the tune. Guess what we've been doing today. Guess where we are. There's a very subtle audio.
That's a bloody freight train, that is.
Yes, we've officially been sent onto a freight train.
Yeah. Well, it's not a bankrolled podcast, you see, so we just we just have to slum it.
This is the only way that we get to leave our usual studio, is going on the cheapest cargo.
Yeah.
So just to say an extra special thank you to Matthew and Lucy Pritchard for giving us permission and allowing us to go and look at this amazing stuff, and Joe Keogh, who is the archivist who dug out so many brilliant things for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Gwenny, too.
Oh.